Traditionally, to make it authentic, you'd get lens flare in camera. But with real lens flare, you can generate and customize lens flares completely in post with ease and spectacular result. Filming practical lens flare gives you authenticity, no doubt about that. But it also locks you in with a flare baked onto your image. Whatever you've captured on the set will stay as it is in your image. And if you are planning to add some visual effects element onto your shot later on, which will require tracking and color corrections, having a footage with lens flare baked in could cause some extra time in the post-production that easily can translate as frustration. Trust me, it won't be a convenient experience. In this video, I'm going to show you the important controls in Red Giant Real Lens Flare to help you navigating it with ease. With Real Lens Flare, you get a total creative control to position the light source wherever you want, customize the intensity, colorize, attach it to attract motions, and animate it. Real Lens Flare is perfect for post-productions, VFX work, stylized video, or adding life to 3D renders. And no, Real Lens Flare is not just generating sprites, but instead, it generates procedural elements based on the light simulation inside the engine. Real Lens Flare was originally released for After Effects, but since at Maxon, we always try to provide an equal experience everywhere for our artists. You can now find Real Lens Flare running in Premiere Pro as well as DaVinci Resolve. In DaVinci Resolve, you can use it in the cut or edit page, color page, as well as in the fusion page. So really, the choice is yours. If you want to create a quick lens flare for your edit, then dropping it in the cut or edit page is probably something that you want to do. Make sure you'll activate the OpenFX overlay option under the Resolve viewer to have an access to the on-screen control to adjust the locations of your flare. If you want to add texture to elaborate your color grade, then you can also use Real Lens Flare in the color page to complement your grade. But if you want to push Real Lens Flare to its limit, it is thriving in Fusion page. Real Lens Flares offers a designer interface that you can access by clicking the Open Designer button. You can use this designer window to customize the appearance of your lens flares and fine-tuning your result down to the optical coating of each virtual lens element. It offers greater granularity and control. Consider the designer window as your virtual lab to do all your crazy lens flare experiments. If you want to visually simulate the different look of flares coming from different lenses, then working in the designer is something that you want to do. In the designer, you can make practically unlimited numbers of lens flares, and you can also modify those lens flares to your liking. If there's a lens flare effect that you want, from a lens flare captured by consumer camera phone to the lens flare obtained in premium vintage cinema glasses, the designer can recreate it. Real Lens Flare's designer allow you to simulate the flares with most realism possible. Over time, you can expect more and more features to be integrated within the Real Lens Flare designer interface. The designer window has main preview pane in the middle. You can choose whether you want to see your flare laid out on top of your image or just on a simple black background using the image button at the top of the viewer. Sometimes, monitoring the flare you created right on top of your image is really nice. But some other time, when you want to tweak the tiniest detail, having a neutral black background will help you to observe even the most minute nuances. Also notice that in the designer window, dragging the locations of the flare will not change the position in your footage. So the position inside the designer window is merely a preview. The idea is that you can preview your lens flare anywhere on screen to see how it integrates with the shot. But for the final location, you will need to use the location controls in the effects control panel outside the designer window. Use the designer to design your flares and use the parameters on the effect control panel to control and animate your flares to see how it interacts with your finished shot. Below the preview pane, you'll see the projection strip. These are the elements of your flare. You can consider it as the recipe of your final flare. Each block of element contribute to the final look of your lens flare. You can control the way each element add to the look by clicking on this block and change the value in the inspector pane on the right side of the preview pane. For example, this default flare consists of 6 different elements, that was simulated through our lens prescription in the lens pane down below. In Real Lens Flare Dictionary, each of this element is called the core projection. By taking a glance at the projection strip, we can understand that the final look of our lens flare is achieved by combining these 6 different core projections. We have 1 starburst, 3 different glow balls, 1 gate flare, and 1 reflection. If I don't like the look of the reflection, I can simply hide it using the preview button on the core projection block or on the inspector pane. Bear in mind that we cannot rearrange the order of these core projections unlike in Magic Bullet looks. The sequence of these core projections are carefully crafted to give you the most realistic lens flare result. Now let's disable our image overlay to have a better overview of our lens flare. So here it is with the reflection on, and here it is with reflection off. You see that the reflections is a big part of our lens flare. You can add more core projections for your lens flare using the plus icon on the left side of the projection pane. For example, if we want to create the look of a dirt or grime on a lens without having too much lens flare itself, we can definitely achieve that using Real Lens Flare. Let's delete all these core projections by right-clicking them and select Delete. You can also select them and hit Delete or Backspace on your keyboard to delete them. Notice that the reflections is the only core projections that we cannot delete from the projection pane, but we can still hide it. Dirt or grime on a lens has to have a visible effect projected on the captured image, and we can recreate that effect in Real Lens Flare by adding Schmutz. Schmutz is the most complex Real Lens Flare core projection. At its simplest, Schmutz mimics the dust, debris, or smudging on a lens, and when light hits the glass surface with grime, it produces artifacts like sparkling or defocusing. Let's click the plus button and add Schmutz to our flare. Here in the inspector pane, you can see that there are many different textures that you can use as the base for your Schmutz. Let's select splatter for this example. Let's also enable our image back on to preview the Schmutz on our shot. We can set Schmutz to be affected by the aperture of our lens by enabling the option f-stop effect defocus. Let's also disable light source illumination, and you may think that we lost our Schmutz. But don't worry, it is still there. We just don't have a light source to illuminate the Schmutz. Notice that if we turn the light source illumination back on, we see that our Schmutz is having a different color than the lighting in our shot. We can of course colorize our Schmutz using the color wheel if we want to, but what I want to do here is to let Schmutz to be entirely affected by the illuminations coming from our image, just like in real life. And in Schmutz, that is possible with the options within illumination from background. You can simply check the background illuminations and we can faintly see that we have our Schmutz back. Now, to make it more visible, we can easily modify the exposure of our Schmutz. Let's set it to +4 stops. Now we can see our Schmutz more clearly, just like we want it. You can also affect the spread of the Schmutz, and you can also set whether you want Schmutz to be present only on the highlight area in your image. You can always double-click on a parameter to reset it back to its default value. Previously, we've set the Schmutz to be affected by the aperture size. So now if we are changing our lens aperture, theoretically, we should see changes on our Schmutz as well. We can change the lens aperture using the aperture parameters in the inspector pane, or we can also click the aperture symbol on the lens pane. If I change the f-stop as well as the number of aperture blades, you'll see that we are effectively changing the look of our Schmutz as well. So let's change the f-stop to something like 5.6 and the aperture blades to 3 to have some sort of triangular shape for our aperture. And now, let's hit confirm on the footer menu. And as I play my clip, I successfully simulate dirt on my lens that interacts with the light in my scene. As you can see, as I scrub the playhead, the Schmutz will change its color based on the pixel value under it, replicating the lighting that was captured on the scene. Now, whether or not you want to show the complete lens flare to add onto your Schmutz, it is now a very simple choice. If you want to, you can now simply add up different core projections to complement the Schmutz. But if you don't want to, you can also just leave it as it is. Doing so, we have easily simulate the look of dirty lens that is not really flaring as much, but still organically interacts with the lighting on the scene. This is important when you want to simulate the look of applying a smeared Vaseline on the clear glass filter in front of the lens and shoot on a rainy set, similar to what was done in the Batman film, a beautiful masterpiece and a visual galore. And don't take my word for it. Here's Matt Reeves' explanations about this.
There were times when Greg would take a silicone filter and put a little bit of silicone on it. I mean, people would take a filter and put a little bit of silicone, and so that when you put it in front of the lens and when it got wet, you had the sense that it wasn't just that we were in rain, that was perfectly photographed, the lens itself got wet, so you feel like you're in the middle of it. And so everything was about putting you squarely in that experience.
Since real lens flare is simulating the light hitting the lens element, scatter around and project it onto our image, we can modify the look of our flare simply by changing the color temperature of our source light, the size of our aperture, or even the sensor size of our camera. Like what we have seen previously with the Schmutz, changing the aperture size will change the look of your effect. This is also true for the other core projections. That is because all of these core projections are generated based on the aperture, based on the setup of how light source enters the lens prescription, interacting with the aperture shape and size, and finally get projected to the sensor surface. Here in the Lens Pane, we can change the light source, which determines the light source quality being sent into the simulation. And we also have the color wheel to emulate the color filter in front of our light source. And as we are changing the quality of our light source, we can also monitor the spectral distributions of our light source in the graph under the color wheel. You can also change the sensor size to match the camera that you were using to capture your footage to match the look of the flare that you want to generate. And if you want to go down to the detail, you can also select each of this lens element and modify their coating color, their refractive index, and the chroma dispersion. The AR, or anti-reflective coating, influences the amount of transmissions of the selected color. If we set the thickness value to 100, it means that we have full transmission and it will fully transmit the selected color. And the refractive index will control how fast light moves through the lens. Meanwhile, chroma dispersion set how much different wavelengths of light will be split on the ghosting artifacts. In other words, it determines how much lens element is prone to chromatic aberration. So if you have access to some lens whitepaper which normally document the lens technical specs, you can now simulate your lens flare based on the real technical specifications of that specific lens. But you can also use this parameter to creatively tweak the look of your flare. So now let's hit reset on top of our preview pane to set our flare back to its default. Previously, you've seen how you can add core projections to the projection strip, and we've successfully replicated the look of dirty lens using only Schmutz core projection. So let's check out the other available core projections. Core projections are the building blocks of lens flare. Let's add a light ball to our core projection strip. Light ball core projection's main purpose is to simulate a light source. You have the complete controls to adjust the look, size, and color of your light source using the available controls in the inspector pane. Since we are generating a light source with the light ball, we can also repurpose the use of real lens flare to just spice up a boring shot. For example, when we have a golden hour shot, but due to the atmospheric haze, the sun in the shot wasn't that spectacular, we can definitely use the real lens flare light ball to spice up the sunset in our shot. We can temporarily disable the image to view our light ball on a black background. Now let's add our exposure to +2 stops and play around with the softness. Also, we can tweak the bloom and bloom size to spread and blurs the light ball, creating a haze effect around our light ball. And since it's a golden hour shot, we can change our light source temperature to something like 3200 degrees in the scale of Kelvin. We can also play around with the light ball colorize parameter to match the sun or even make it warmer than the sun in the shot. And now, to make it even more realistic, we can add another glow ball core projections to our light ball to add a glow around it. let's increase the chromaticity to 100% to create the rainbow-like effects around our glow. Currently, it is not that pleasing, but if we are going to solo our glow ball and view it on top of our image, we can see playing around with the chromaticity is indeed creating this colorful banding to our glow. If I want to, I can also play around with the chroma frequency to adjust the distance between my rainbow banding. Perhaps, let's go back with our black background. I want my rainbow banding to be sparse, so here I can go with a low value. And now I can colorize my glow to match my light ball or even set it to something even redder. I can also increase the position fall-off to create a visibility curve which decreases the opacity of the core projections from the center toward the edge. And now, I can use spikiness to create a ray of lights on the edge of my glow, adding some variations to my glow. And now, let's bump the value around 77% and I'll leave the spike scale to its default value. Now, we can play around with the spike position motion. If 0% creates a fully still spikes and 100% creates a fully active and twinkly spikes, then I'll go and split the difference and set it to 50%. And I can also adjust the spike evolution if I want to change the position of the spikes. But the default position is fine for me, so now let's double-click to reset it back. Now, if we preview our image, with and without the fake sun we've created, I think you'd agree with me that with real lens flare, we just successfully add some life to our shot, making it much more interesting. The parameters in global control set largely match those of the Starburst control set. Let's take a look at Starburst core projection next. The Starburst core projection, accompanied by a lens flare reflection, is probably the look most people associate with the term lens flare. However, starbursts are inherently tied to aperture. That's why within the inspector pane, we also see the control for aperture when selecting the starburst. This is also true for other core projections that have direct relationship with the aperture. Whenever you want to set something in the aperture, you have the access right within the core projection control without first clicking the aperture in the lens pane. The number of blades in the aperture will also determine the number of spikes or points in the starburst. An even number of aperture blades will yield the same number of spikes, but an odd number of blades will yield double the number of spikes. Despite having the same number of starburst points, the spikes for the aperture blades of 3 and 6 have different appearances. Depends on how detailed you want your lens flare. Within the aperture control, you can also set the shape of aperture opening based on how perfect or imperfect the aperture blades were manufactured. You can play around with the curvature, twist, notch, and angle to emulate specific shape of aperture blade which will be reflected in the effect that you created. We will talk more about curvature, notch, and notch angle in a minute. The next core projections we should look into is the halo. You know how smearing grease, fingerprint oil, or some similar substance can create crazy halo effects in lens flare? Sometimes tiny little scratch on lens create a similar effects. Real lens flare faithfully reproduces these artifacts with halo projection. If global core projections is produced from a circular seed, then halos are derived from rings. And just as globals produce fascinating chromatic effects in their spikes, halo creates beautiful rainbow effects in their rings. At its default, you may not see the ring in halo. But as we increase ring scale to 100% and reduce rings to 0%, you'll start to see that our halo is indeed derived from a ring seed. Rings control the amount of rings you have in your effect, while the scale controls the size of our rings. And as we reduce ring scale, we start to see the sparkle, which can be controlled by the sparkle to adjust how obvious you want to see the sparkle. And you can use sparkle size to set the size of your sparkle effect. Bigger value will result in bigger sparkle and vice versa. Similar to global, we also have sparkle position motion, which add twinkling motions as we increase the value. And finally, use the evolution control to add randomness to your sparkle. Specific lens and light source attributes can produce colored rings around lights. The look of a ring around a flare was a popular look in the 1970s and early 80s. Here's the shot from the Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which has abundant ring on its lens flare. The similar ring flare also observed in many other movies like Steven Spielberg's E.T. or Denis Villeneuve's Dune, James Cameron's Avatar, and many more. And if you wonder how you can easily recreate that with real lens flare, you can simply use the Xeno preset Nearby Encounter as your starting point. All you need to do is to adjust the locations and change the color temperature to match the source clip. Ring flares are often subtle by nature, and it may be tougher to spot right away with non-black background, and real lens flares default to values that reflects this. If we set the center offset and position fall-off all the way down to 0, you'll see that moving the ring around doesn't seem to affect the shape of the ring itself. And as we increase the position fall-off, you'll notice that the position of the ring will have an effect to the shape of the ring. Near the center of the screen, it is brighter, and further away, it will fall off to black. You can also invert this so that it will have lesser impact on the center and get brighter towards the edges. And once you're settled with the position fall-off, then you can play around with the center offset to shift the ring position relative to the flare's locations in the image. Next one, we have the single spike core projections, which perhaps is the defining look of the anamorphic flare. At its default value, the single spike, similar to the halo, emulate the sort of artifact you might get from a lens smudge. Oils or other distortions on the lens may create a linear flare that can create a striking effect. And apart from having a similar control like any other core projections like chromaticity and chroma frequency, which mimics prismatic quality of the lens optic and their coatings, in single spike you also have spread to adjust the spread and the light beam and angle to control the rotations of the beam. There is also this unidirectional control, which makes the two beams travel in equal opposite directions from a central source when set to 0. A spike with 100% unidirectionality results in a single beam that travels out in one direction from the source. And when used carefully, these controls allow you to create variations to your spike, which result in a more organic look. Try combining the single spike with other core projections to add layered visual complexity. If you need a great starting point when emulating anamorphic flares, try using the anamorphic lens simulation presets. Speaking of anamorphic, if we click the lens pane under the lens, you'll see the anamorphic factor control. You can use this parameter to decide anamorphic factor of the lens that you want to emulate. When we are changing the anamorphic factor here, for example, let's set it to 2, all the anamorphic effects will be calculated to the anamorphic factor of 2 for all core projections that we used. But in the core projections itself, there is this checkbox Auto Anamorphic, which is checked by default. This indicates that the core projections is respecting the anamorphic factor set in the lens setting, while when deselecting it, we can then set our own anamorphic factor for this particular core projection. And the anamorphic factor in core projection only affects that particular core projection. By default, it is set to play along with the lens anamorphic factor, just like in real life. But if tweaking it is what you're after, you can surely do that as well. Anamorphic is a huge topic in cinematography, and its effects certainly play a big impact in our visual memories. But we won't be diving into the anamorphic discussion in this video. But if you're curious, I highly recommend to check out this video from our friend at Media Division, which brilliantly informative as well as entertaining. Finally, we have the gate flare core projection. A gate flare mimics the effects of light bleeding through an opening just off the edge of the field of view. To use the gate flare, we will need to set the light source position just outside of the edge of the frame. And as we drag the on-screen control to the outside of the frame, you can see the gate flare effects showing up on our designer. So this effect will only take place when the light source of our lens flare is hitting the edge of the frame. Otherwise, it won't show up when it is in the center of the frame. The same exact behavior of light bleeding into our frame as we pointed our lens away or toward the light source at a certain angle. There are some basic controls like size, exposure, and colorize that you can use to modify your gate flare. Previously, we briefly saw the reflection. Reflection is the only core projections that cannot be deleted from the projection strip and also cannot be added from the plus menu. Real lens flare does this to help preserve the clarity of core projections forms when first viewed. There is not much of properties in the reflection that we can tweak apart from its exposure, scale, and color. That is just mainly due to the fact that the flare reflections are mainly influenced by the type of the lens that we are using, the coating, and the material of each lens element and how the aperture shape looks. So if we are going to select a spherical lens preset and deactivate all core projections but the reflection, you'll notice that the reflections is inherently different compared to our previous lens model, which was using an anamorphic lens prescription to simulate the flare. Because all of the core projections of real lens flare are derived from this real-world model, you can create great variety of lens flare by adjusting real-world controls like the lens aperture, the size of the sensor, as well as the quality of the light source. In the case of our reflections, that can be done by changing the lens element coating and thickness as well as the full aperture controls in the inspector pane when selecting reflection core projection. And similar to real life, the f-stop will determine the size of the reflections. Bigger f-stop results in bigger and softer reflection, and the amount of blades will determine the shape of your reflection. The curvature, notch, and notch angle are simulating the imperfections of the aperture blades. Depends on the manufacturing method, some of the aperture blades are not dead straight. There are sometimes a curvature in this single aperture blades that when combined together will form a certain shape. This certainly can be emulated using these three controls. And once you're happy, you can then use the angle to rotate the reflection. The diffraction control simulates how light waves bend around the aperture edges. This subtle effects creates a ripple effects in the reflection. The higher the diffraction value, the more noticeable the ripples. In layman terms, this is the control that you can use if you want to add or remove the onion skin effects in your core projection. Now, if you are familiar with Maxon Red Giant tool, you'll notice that our tool normally comes with a lot of presets that can be used as a starting point. At Maxon, we put a lot of effort in making these presets to help moving the finish line of a project closer to the starting point for our users. Real lens flare comes with a lot of presets that varies from anamorphic and spherical lens simulations to some fun and cool looking flares inspired from many different movies. And as you pick one of these presets, the recipe will be shown both in the projection strip and the Lens Pane. And you can tweak each individual core projections, add or remove, and even save it as your own preset. You can use the search bar to search for specific preset. You can search preset name, or just a keyword, which by the way you can stack, or even a movie name. And once you're happy with the flare you are creating, this is where you want to click the confirm button in the footer menu. So, that is Real Lens Flare Designer. Use it to design the most complex and realistic lens flare and save it as a preset that you can reuse for different projects. Next up, we'll take a look at the effects control panels that you can use to position, animate, and obscure your lens flare. See you soon!